Hello, and thank you for joining me today on this video titled Addiction, the Whats, Whys, and Hows, where we will discuss what addiction is, why it happens, and how it works. An estimated 19.7 million Americans have an addiction, which is over 10 times the population of West Virginia. But what does addiction mean? And that is a great question. The National Institute on Drug Abuse defines addiction as a chronic, relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. In other words, addiction is a lifelong illness that has recurring periods of substance use and recovery. During periods of substance use, a person continues seeking and using regardless of the consequences. Now that we know what an addiction is, why does it occur? Addiction is the result of a mix of many different biological and environmental factors, and it is not the same for each person, which is why one person may use a substance and an addiction doesn't develop, but it does for another person. Let's take a closer look at the biological factors. Genes are passed down from biological parent to child and can determine or influence many of our traits like eye and hair color. For addiction, this means if a biological parent or family member has an addiction, a child is more likely to develop an addiction later in life. The developmental age of a person also matters when they first use. For example, we know that the earlier a person tries a substance, the more likely an addiction will develop later in life. And lastly, we also know that individuals who have other mental health disorders such as depression or anxiety, they're also more likely to use a substance and develop an addiction. Now, let's take a closer look at the environmental factors. It is common knowledge that the households we live in are influential in our future outcomes, and the same is true for addiction. Individuals who grew up in homes with addiction are more likely to have an addiction develop later in life. Our peers and friends are the second most influential environmental factors for a whole host of outcomes. Individuals who have friends with an addiction are also more likely to have an addiction themselves. A majority of children spend a significant amount of time in schools, and it makes sense that there is a relationship between schools and students' likelihood of developing an addiction. Students who attend school regularly are less likely to have an addiction develop. Individuals who live in communities that have access to high-quality services such as healthcare and education or provide regular prevention programming are less likely to have an addiction develop later in life. Though we discussed biological and environmental factors separately, we know that these factors can and do influence one another. So let's take a step back and think about what makes us up. Our body is made up of DNA, which carries the genetic information that makes up all people. Our DNA provides the instructions for how genes are expressed in us, such as our eye or hair color. Think of DNA as providing instructions for whether genes are turned on or off, kind of like a light switch. But there are things in our environment that can also influence whether or not genes are expressed. Let's take this person. We'll call them Morgan. And these are Morgan's genes. And let's say Morgan is at risk for developing diabetes, so that gene or genes may be turned on or more likely to be expressed simply because Morgan's DNA provided that instruction. Let's also say Morgan is likely to be short, so that the genes or genes may also be turned on or more likely to be expressed simply because Morgan's DNA provided that instruction. But as I said earlier, it's not just our genetics that influence our development, but also our environment, such as nutrition and physical activity. So let's say Morgan eats balanced meals, drinks plenty of water, and gets the recommended amount of physical activity. Good job, Morgan. Because of Morgan's lifestyle, aka their environment, Morgan's genes for diabetes and being short may be turned off or less likely to be expressed. In other words, while Morgan's DNA provided instructions for certain genes to be turned on or expressed, Morgan's environment also impacted the expression of those same genes, reducing the likelihood of them developing diabetes and potentially increasing their height. This is why it is important to explore the biological and environmental factors that can impact the development of an addiction. While a person's DNA may provide instructions for certain genes to be turned on or off, their environment, such as their home, peers, school, and community, can also impact gene expression. Before we go forward, a word of caution. This is a simplistic overview of how a person's biology and environment could impact the development of an addiction. But how an addiction is impacted is highly complex and is still being researched. We've covered the what, the why, and now we're going to cover the how of addiction. And to do that, we've got to look at the brain. Our brain is responsible for sending and receiving chemical and electrical signals throughout our entire body. And it does this through cells called neurons. For today, we're only going to review 3 parts of a neuron. The axon terminals and axon are responsible for sending signals away from the neuron and passing it to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Dendrites are responsible for receiving the signals from other neurons, muscles, or glands. And the signals I keep mentioning are neurotransmitters, which are chemical messages that are released from one cell to another through electrical charges in a neuron. The way it works is this. Dendrites receive neurotransmitters, and the chemical message is passed from the dendrites across the axon to the axon terminals, which releases more neurotransmitters, which another neuron's dendrites will receive, and then the chemical message repeats the process of going across the axon to the axon terminals, which releases more neurotransmitters. So for Morgan, when they encounter a dog and the dog makes them happy, there are neurotransmitters being carried throughout their body, making them feel happy. This same process occurs whenever someone uses a substance, except the substances hijack this natural communication process and overwhelms the brain with neurotransmitters. In short, addiction is complex, and the research community is learning more every day. What we do know is that there are many possible causes to an addiction, that it is a brain disease, and it impacts everyone. Stay connected with Breaking the Cycle by visiting our website below. Breaking the Cycle is an initiative of the Adventure Group that is focused on bringing awareness to and preventing adverse childhood experiences and their negative impacts by working with children, families, schools, and communities. Breaking the Cycle and its related materials are made possible by the Claude Worthington Benedum Foundation.